All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Thanks again to our diamond sponsor, Island, along with our sponsors for this session, Sumo Logic and Palo Alto, and of course the ISSA chapter. So what we'll get here with Mr. Sparrell. Duncan has a distinguished career in cybersecurity and software development. He's credited with over 18 patents and has received numerous awards, including the Intelligence Community SEAL Medallion, which I thought was pretty cool to mention. I don't know if you all read his bio. It's quite impressive, along with the AT&T Science and Technology Medal. So let's give Duncan a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Mic check. Everybody hear me okay? All right. See some thumbs up. That's good. So I'm going to be talking about how to save time and money using automation and how cybersecurity standards help that. I'll start out with us getting to know each other a little bit better, talk a little bit about me, but more ask you guys some questions to get to learn, calibrate me a little bit on where everybody's coming from. We'll cover why the topic's important and why it's a little more important now than it has been. Talk about some of the underlying economics of cybersecurity and how to apply them to the business cases, as was discussed in the keynote, to actually get the things that you need to do, and how it relates in particular to automation, give you some data to support your business cases for doing that. Talk a little about an effort I'm involved in called the Cybersecurity Automation Village, which runs a bunch of tabletop exercises, sort of similar to what the previous talk was just on how to prove in some of this automation. Have a couple sidebars along the way, one in something I'm involved in, software supply chain security and SBOM, software bill of materials. Another little bit of sidebar into some geopolitics involved in some of these standards, because for some reason the Russians and Iranians don't want us to actually share threat information. Can't see why. But anyway, then I'll finish up with some summarization of what I'll be talking about. I do know this is the AI track, but this is not an AI talk. This is an automation talk, sort of a pre-AI track, I guess I would call it. My tagline is think evilly, act ethically. I'll put on I think it's 5 of the slides, I'll put these little takeaway boxes down in the corner as, hey, that's something you really want to take away, hopefully. If you are one of the ones that, like me, can think evilly very well, you'll also include the act ethically part of it. So if you saw the keynote this morning, Alyssa sort of alluded to how old she was. I am several decades older than she is. So I was born in 1955 along with McDonald's and Velcro. And how many people in the room, raise your hand if you were alive in 1955? I am literally the only person in this. I'm the oldest person in this room. That is good to know. All right, next big career milestone for me was 1978, which happens to be when Animal House came out, and I will neither confirm nor deny whether it was based on my fraternity. But it was also when homebrewing beer became legal. And it's also when I graduated with my master's degree and went to work at the storied Bell Telephone Laboratories. So how many people in here are younger than that homebrewing beer has always been legal? Raise your hand if you were born in 1978 or later. A fair chunk, and that means a fair chunk is somewhere in between. And then what sort of matters more to this talk is 1990. Now, I happen to be friends with the guy who was in charge of the infrared telescope on the Hubble Space Telescope, which is what made that pretty picture in the corner. But more important to my career is Saddam Hussein in Iraq invaded Kuwait. And that kicked off Operation Desert Shield, which was the preparation in 1990 for Operation Desert Storm, which was the first Iraqi war in January of 1991. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but I had a reputation in the intelligence community as a hacker. Now, this is 1990. The movie that coined the term hacker didn't come out for another 2 years yet, the movie Sneakers. So I didn't know I was a hacker. I didn't know I'd been doing red teaming, because that concept didn't exist yet. But I was the guy they sort of went to say, hey, let's let Duncan play with the computers, and if he can figure out what's going on in this classified program, we probably shouldn't let unclassified people at it. And because of that reputation, I was shipped down to something called the Air Force Information Warfare Center. Now again, this is 1990. This is back in 4.8 kilobit modem days. Literally, the concept of information warfare was alien to me. I did not comprehend the concept until I was read into these programs. And while Alyssa, the keynote speaker, was hacking into dial-up modems here in the US, I was hacking into Iraqi air defense. Learned quite a lot from that experience. Learned about social engineering, learned about just hacking in general, but learned a lot about the whole mission plan and stuff like that, which is something the US military does very well. So I am older than hacking. How many people in this room are younger than hacking? How many people were born in 1990 or later? Again, a fair number of youngsters. So I have always, you have always known that hacking existed. To me, it was an alien concept when I first got introduced to it. One sort of final intro topic. How many people are familiar with fist to five? Concept, you can give feedback to the speaker. I'll be asking some questions. First one I'll do right now to sort of get everybody used to it. I'm going to throw up literally a picture of alphabet soup that's going to have some tomato soup with different words spelled out in it that are all sort of acronyms involved in cybersecurity automation. If you don't know any of them, hold up a fist. If you know 5 or more of them, hold up 5. If you know 2, what'll show up there is, maybe you know what an S-bomb is, you know what STIX is, but they're the only 2 you know, then hold up a 2. Then I'll show another slide after that, which has almost the same set, but a slightly different set on it. Just to sort of, 1, wake everybody up, and 2, help me calibrate on the gobbledygook that I'm going to be talking about, how many people might know anything about it. So first, here's the alphabet soup. Everybody hold up a hand. I can literally say a 5. Come on, you got to hold up your hand. You got to say something. You know some of them, you know none of them. Otherwise, I'm going to call you out and yell at you, so. All right, seeing some 1s, some 2s, some 3s, some 4s. Do I see any 5s? Oh, maybe a 5, good. All right, we got a wide mix, so hopefully some people learned something. Here's an actual slide from... No, they're not anagrams. They're all actual acronyms. Here's a slide from actually later in the talk that I'll actually talk to later. But again, has a couple more on it. Again, raise your hand. Come on, wake up. It's, middle of the morning. You guys can do it. All right, we got again, a pretty wide mix. We got some people still sleeping that won't raise their hand, but that's okay. All right, well, thank you for doing that. Again, hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll at least have heard more of them. I'm not expecting you to memorize any of them, but you might know why you might want to look some of them up afterwards. So cybersecurity standards enable automation, saving both time, people, and money. I'll get into the people aspects a little bit also. So why is now more important than ever? We'll cover that in a couple ways, but this is literally from within the last week in the Washington Post. The director of the FBI is quoted as saying that he now spends over half of his time on cybersecurity incidents, which if you think about it is a really big deal. So things are getting worse, but what's that have to do with money? So again, I'll throw up some money slides. Cybercrime is skyrocketing. 2 things to take away, or 3 things to take away from this. 1, the numbers in this are totally incomprehensible. Trillions of dollars are just too big for anybody to comprehend. But what you can comprehend is the trend, that it's upward. What you can also comprehend is if you look at this sort of same slide over the last several years where everybody tries to predict the future, it's worse every single year. In other words, we say it's going to get worse, and then when we do the next year's, it's even worse than we said it was going to be. So again, there's, Willie Sutton said, why do you rob banks? He said, because that's where the money is. That's why cybercrime is skyrocketing similarly. But it's not just a criminal enterprise issue. It's a national cybersecurity issue as well. So there's this great quote in Executive Order 14028 from almost 2 years ago now, I guess, that in the end, the trust we place in our digital infrastructure should be proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is and to the consequences we'll incur if that trust is misplaced. So it's sort of what I would call a North Star of cybersecurity that we sort of look at everything in the context of. But also, per Alyssa's keynote this morning, we should look at everything in the context of, but what does it mean to our organization? What does it mean to our purpose, to our business? So show me the money. What's the money in that previous statement that just got mentioned? Well, I'll show you some second order effects to it also, but the first order effect is, we're going in the right order here, is the executive order says that the executive branch, which spends $1 trillion a year, is going to start using the power of the federal purse to improve cybersecurity. In other words, they're going to start only buying things that are more secure, and there's a couple particular things associated with that in the field of cybersecurity automation and in software supply chain where that will make a big difference. Now again, if you're not a federal contractor, you might not care about that, but we need to look at it from sort of everybody's viewpoint. So in every talk I've ever given, I think for the last 10 years, I think it came out about 10 years ago, I always show this book. That's actually the old version. The new version is actually out. I don't know these people personally, but I really hawk their books because I think it's got some really fundamental stuff in it that is really important. And I would highly recommend it to everybody, so much so that at the end when we do Q&A, I'm going to give this away to this particular book I'm going to give to somebody. So 2 points I'm going to cover, both basically addressing, I'll say one of the main points of Alyssa's keynote this morning of you have to be able to talk to your business counterparts. But another point that she made that they make in the book is we just got to get over ourselves in cybersecurity. We think we're, special snowflakes and that we have it so bad, our stuff's profoundly chaotic and we don't get enough data and we have massive risk, and oh, by the way, there are other fields that have these issues too, particularly finance and weather, and there's a lot of science behind that we can learn from, and a lot of that's in this book. Now, one of the other things that I think is important is we need to speak in terms to our business counterparts. To do that, we have to speak their language. And they speak the language of finance. They care about money. So one of the premises of the book is you should turn everything into quantitative risk analysis. How much money, what's the probability of how much money you're going to lose if you do, choice A or choice B or what our steady state is. So they make these things called loss exceedance curves. It's the type of stuff quants in your CFO office will understand, but it's pretty simple really. You say, hey, in the next time period, 1 year, 5 year, you can do either one. We're high probability we're going to lose at least this much due to some cybersecurity incidents. The most likely view of what's going to happen is 5 million. You notice those aren't that far apart. That's a log scale across the bottom. And there's a low probability, but of a very high impact event of there's a 3% chance we're going to lose 400 million. So it's just 3 data points. You can get a reasonable line out of that. It's a concept that people really understand, and you'll say, but yeah, this is really hard to do. I'm not smart enough to know. You don't need to be too precise at doing this. You just need to be good enough comparatively. Why does it keep going backwards? I keep hitting the wrong button. So maybe you have the orange case is the state that you're currently in. You're saying, hey, we want to spend some more money to do something. Well, what's the impact of doing that? Well, first off, it's going to cost some money to do it. So there's a 5% chance you're going to spend $100,000 you didn't need to do, okay? Because there's a chance it doesn't actually improve things. But it's a low chance, so that's good. The most likely view is you're going to save $4 million, okay? Well, almost any financial office that you say, hey, I'd like to spend $100,000 to save $4 million, that sort of math is going to go over big if you really do have one that's that good. Okay, and in this one, it's a double win because you can also say that, this one might even be more what justifies is it, that $400 million loss, if we don't do this, we'll have a 10% probability. So again, it's a low probability, but it's still high enough that a CEO should be making that call of, hey, are we willing to roll the dice at 1 out of 10, we're going to go out of business. Then you might reduce it down to 3%, which again might be, okay, I can live with 3%. That's going to be beyond my tenure, that sort of thing. So you just need to be good enough to do the relative comparisons. So again, a real quick exercise to sort of get people calibrated. People think this is too hard to do. We're going to do a really, really simple version of it. And the simple version is, think of your organization and how big it is, and think of the bottom scale as a number that means a really big deal to your organization. You work for AT&T like I used to, the one down at the lower right might be a B, okay? You work for now an independent consultant like I am now, it might actually still be the $1,000 that shows there. Whatever is the right size to you of a really big event, okay? And then I'm gonna ask you to raise your hands again, fist to 5 or some number in between. And if your organization is so good that there's virtually no chance of a huge loss, then you're gonna put up all your fingers. If your organization is so horrible that you're pretty sure it's gonna go out of business within the next year because you have no idea what you're doing and the hackers are already in there, then you're gonna put up a fist. Now, most likely people are gonna put numbers in between, but just sort of think a little bit in your head. Are you sort of nearer the fist end? Are you nearer the 5 end? Note you can't pick the exact middle. You can't put up 2.5 fingers. So you have to either give it a fist 1 or 2 or 3 through 5. Now, everybody raise their hand and give me a number of some sort. Seeing a lot of 3s, see some 4s, that's good. Do I see any fists? I don't think I see any fists. That's actually good. Of course, you're at a security conference, so you're probably working for organizations that know what they're doing. All right, well, thank you. And again, that you just spent seconds on figuring out how to put some data on this curve. If you actually put a little more thought into it and you're looking at your actual business comparisons, you could probably do a half decent job. You can do a good enough job to make the previous chart I did on just doing a relative comparison of, is this investment worth it to the business? Whatever it is that I'm now proposing, to put in or do. And that's the kind of thing you need to do to meet Alyssa's talk the language of the business that we talked about earlier. So there's actually some people who've done a lot of work on this. There's something called the FAIR Institute. FAIR stands for Factor Analysis of Information Risk. You can go to fairinstitute.org. They got a lot of data on this. They sort of break down that overall, hey, what's the risks involved here and how to turn that into money. They have this sort of very simple chart of, it's sort of how often it's likely to happen versus how big it's likely to be. And then they sort of break that down further and go into that. But again, you can do it to different levels. So since I retired about 10 years ago from AT&T as their chief security architect, and needed to do something, so I got involved in a lot of cybersecurity standards, got involved in a lot of nonprofits. It turns out if you go to get involved in nonprofits and you want to get on their boards, they basically look for something from you. They look either for, hey, you got a lot of time to give that they need, particularly if you have a particular talent that they need, or you got to donate a lot of money. Okay, so this sort of concept of time, talent, and treasure comes up a lot in nonprofits. Well, I've actually found it's a good mechanism, it's a good paradigm to use for advising C-suites, okay? They tend to actually think the same way, okay? It tends to be, how quickly you do things, how much labor it takes, and both of those are fairly easy to translate into, and what's it gonna mean to us money-wise, because again, that's really what they're all about. So we're gonna present some data associated with sort of what cybersecurity automation is worth to a business. The most important one, and this is one of those, I should have put a little takeaway slide on this one because this is an important one, was a study that Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, the people who protect the software of our nuclear weapons, did a number of years ago now. Their slide was very busy, so I tried to sort of oversimplify it a little bit it was a 3 order of magnitude increase in sort of what they could handle from a triage viewpoint, a 2 order of magnitude increase in sort of how well they were doing it, and most importantly, so this one rate's getting overlaid even on top of the overlay, is they were kicking out the attackers 2 orders of magnitude faster. So we're doing it in hours instead of weeks, okay? You can do a lot of damage if you're in somebody's system for weeks. You can't do as much damage if you're only in there for a couple hours. And so this sort of 2 orders of magnitude improvement is the type of thing that you can plug in to the FAIR model, or you can plug into the Hubbard-Searson stuff to show, now again, you got to do it for your particular case, but can show the value of doing this. So what's this automation that was talked about in this particular study? So a bunch of different ones. I'm going to use one particular example of a developer developed some software. They create these things called SBOMs, software bill of materials. I'm going to spend a little more time on that. Hopefully they're doing that as part of their build process. But the software has a vulnerability. Unfortunately, a threat actor, a bad guy, figures out about it and attacks making use of this. The attack creates these things called indicators or indicators of compromise. There's actually a standard called STIX on structured threat information exchange on basically how to share indicators of compromise. I'm sort of hoping a lot of the fingers that came up earlier, at least one of the fingers was hopefully people have heard of STIX before. And TAXII is sort of a way to carry STIX around. It's its transport mechanism. And I'll talk more about STIX in a few moments. But once you've sort of figured out, hey, we're under attack, we need to do something about it, the do something about it is called a course of action. And there's a standard on standardizing how to share these courses of action so we can all learn from each other. And that's called CACAO, which is actually complicated enough, I'm gonna have to look up myself, is Collaborative Automated Course of Action Operations. I happen to be friends with the guy who created it. He happens to like chocolate and cacao, so that's why he went out of his way to make this convoluted acronym, but CACAO is easy to remember. And the course of action are to do things. Well, what are the things you do? Well, you send commands to devices. You might change the threat level on your IDS, or you might block some particular domains on your firewalls or whatever. You can do that with OpenC2. And then, hopefully, because this all sort of started with a software vulnerability, you share the information about what was actually vulnerable with a standard called CSAF, which is Computer Security Advisory Framework. And it has a particular aspect of something called VEX, which is Vulnerability Exchange. Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. So the fact that it is actually exploitable, you want to share that with people. And it turns out this particular CSAF VEX format is also useful for sharing when you're saying, no, this particular bug doesn't apply to me. Yes, log4j or log4shell against log4j does not happen to apply to the software on this Raspberry Pi. I'm going to show in a few minutes because it's written all in Elixir. It's not even in Java, so I don't have that log4j in there. So I can put out a VEX statement saying, hey, I don't need to worry about that particular vulnerability. So using these standards allows this was some of the standards actually used in the automation study by Johns Hopkins that I showed a minute or two ago.
Quick question for you.
Sure.
CSAF and the VEX, is that really like responsible disclosure sort of thoughts?
Yes and no. They're very closely related concepts. So VEX is a standard way, a standard automated way, so you can automate all this stuff for computers to tell other computers about, hey, these vulnerabilities matter, and they matter a lot, or they matter a little, or they don't matter at all. When you should send that and who you should send that to is associated with coordinated and disclosure. So you could use a VEX if you were the security researcher who found a new vulnerability. You could actually use a VEX to do your responsible disclosure to the vendor, not to the world, because you're doing it responsibly, okay? And then they could later, and it could evolve. VEXs tend to evolve over time to being one of the first states is under investigation. Yeah, I don't even know what's going on yet. To yeah, here's the patch and it's fixed in this one and you should do whatever. But yeah, and I'll get into some of the software transparency stuff in a couple minutes. But because I mentioned STIX, I'm going to do just a brief sidebar into some global politics. I happen to have been involved in STIX since back when it was a DHS project before they opened it up to be a standard. It is now an OASIS standard. OASIS is a global standards organization that I would sort of call the minor leagues of global standards organization. And the United States actually brought this as a standard to the International Telecommunications Union, which is a UN agency, which is sort of we'll call it the major leagues of global standardization. And for some reason, the Russians and the Iranians don't want us to have a standard in sharing threat information. I can't understand why. But anyway, over a beer sometime, if people want, I could talk for hours at length of all the shenanigans that have went on literally over in Geneva I've been part of the US State Department delegation that was involved in doing this. I'm proud to say we are getting it through the standards process. I'm sorry to say it's taking way longer because all said and done, the Russians and the Iranians are actually pretty good at what they do at screwing us up. And we made some stupid mistakes of our own along the way, which I'd be happy to discuss over a beer sometime. But that's a sidebar. So talking a little bit about standards, I'm sure everybody's seen the XKCD cartoon on how, there's 14 standards, so let's make a standard to, cover them all, and then there's now you have 15 competing standards. Well, I'd like to offer some counter argument to that, at least in the case of cybersecurity automation. Well, one is the Johns Hopkins University data that we showed before, but some other is from a United Kingdom managed security supplier that even though none of their gear operated using that OpenC2 standard that we talked about before, just them having their analysts use it in their SOC to talk to each other, so that the Cisco guy could talk to the vArmor guy, could talk to the whoever guy or gal. They saw a 25 to 30% efficiency increase in their SOC. Now, again, this is one of these areas where we don't have enough people and it's hard enough to do things. So just by using vendor-agnostic playbooks, got some of the advantages that again was talked about in the keynote of sort of operate just in one ecosystem. This is across ecosystems doing some vendor-agnostic stuff, and that's again where standards really help. So again, this falls into the talent category, but it also falls into the treasury category in that they reported they saved 113,000 pounds per year just by adopting this standard, even though none of their vendors did, just because it helped them. Some other data to support some of the automation stuff. Phantom Cyber is a company that makes SOARs, makes the automation gears. Obviously, they have a vested interest in this data coming out. I'll have some customer data coming later too. But one of their customers reported just by automating their phishing handling, they saw a 50-fold increase in efficiency, which again saved them $1 million a year. So actual, hard cash, real cases. Now, some of the data I'm going to present in a minute comes from an event that just happened a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to do a little bit of a sidebar into software supply chain cybersecurity. So been very involved in, first it was some work in commerce over in the NTIA. Now it's work going on in CISA associated with software bills and materials and in general transparency in the software supply chain. And so CISA holds this event every so often. They held one just a couple weeks ago in Denver. And in Denver, there were about 250 people in the room. There were hundreds of people online attending. The first day was basically a conference with a lot of talks. The second day was a sort of vendor showcase. They made space for 20 vendors. 44 wanted to, so they managed to shoehorn 22 of them in, but even as it was, half the vendors that wanted to show up for this couldn't get in. So it's sort of an exploding area at the moment. And I surveyed some of those people, and I'm on the mailing list for it also. I mailed it out to everybody, both the customer side and the vendor side of this, and got some data from them on the sort of automation associated with software supply chain that I'm going to share some of that. But to do that, I got to explain at least a little bit what's an SBOM. So an SBOM is a software bill of materials. It's basically the ingredients list for your software, which if you haven't ever tried to do it is way more complicated than you realize. There's many layers of dependency. Usual data floats around that somewhere between 70 and 90% of all proprietary software even proprietary software under the hood is even 70 to 90% open source software. So there's a lot of ingredients built on other ingredients built on other ingredients, because it's much easier to not start out from scratch and build your own operating system because I wanted to make a PowerPoint presentation. All right, so I'm using my Mac, I'm using PowerPoint, I'm using lots of existing tools, and that's true of most software in general. So, some other just sort of random factoids on the software supply chain, recent article in a magazine on why you should understand not just sort of your first level dependencies, but what's dependent on what's dependent on what's dependent, is because most upgrades are, again, so open source is evolving just like proprietary is evolving, you're adding new features. Most of them break things as they move along. So 95% of open source version upgrades contain at least one breaking change that'll break something else in your software. Even security patches, 75% of security patches contain at least a breaking change, and about a quarter of all security patches require you to do that first level version upgrade. So you really sort of need to understand this stuff. But the scariest one, in my opinion, is the bottom one, that most, on average, most security advisories come out well after, not they found the vulnerability, well after they've even fixed the vulnerability. So they found it, fixed it, and then a month later tell you about it. Well, that means you were vulnerable that whole time period, and reasons you should sort of maybe understand it yourself. Now, the CrowdStrike causing the Microsoft outage in lots of places is sort of the latest sort of big event to cause some furor. But it is sort of finally tipping the balance some in the regulation area. There were a lot of regulations that already existed. I predict there's been a lot more in preparation that this sort of like kicked the bucket a little bit in getting them further. So Richard Clark, very big name in the industry from way back, even from my time frame, is basically that, hey, the critical infrastructure is mostly owned by private industry in the United States, and it's actually not accountable enough, and so their regulation's going to have to step in. And there have been some that have already happened, first of which, at least that I know of, is in the medical device industry. The FDA now does require medical devices to actually know what the software they're putting out is. I'm old, I happen to sleep on a VPAP each night, which is basically a type of, for sleep apnea. I have two different types. And all said and done, it runs on software. And you can hack that software and literally cut off my oxygen supply in the middle of the night. Those are the types of things they now worry about, which means you probably should understand what the software in there is. So MedCrypt, which is one of these vendors that operates in the medical space of the software supply chain, helps out medical device manufacturers, did a study, talked to both hospitals and to medical device manufacturers, and determined that by automating the processes of both creating the SBOMs, but more importantly, in managing the SBOMs and using them as part of your vulnerability assessment, they cut down the time needed to do, hey, a new Log4j just came out, whatever, reduce their assessment time by 90%, that the automated processes, for the most part, agreed with the human, 99% correlation between the human and the machine. And by the way, the 1%, we don't know if the computer was better or the human was better. We just know they disagreed in 1% of the time. But when they got into some of the details of it, there was an 83% increase in the accuracy when the computer did it versus when the computer did it. So in the particular companies that they looked at, it was a $6 million savings. I mean, it was real dollars and cents you can bring to say that, hey, it's why we should be doing this. Again, sort of in the regulation space, sort of as a follow-on to the executive order, sort of the first shoe falling in the executive branch starting to require better transparency of the supply chain, is the Army now requires in all procurements that they specify the software that they're being provided, where the software came from, including full software bill of materials, license to use those software bill of materials. There's all sorts of legal weird things that occur and all this stuff, and how it's going to be used in the future to do your vulnerability management. So I expect many more government agencies to be following in a similar respect, and several companies have now started doing that as well, particularly in the healthcare industry because of the FDA stuff, but also in the finance industry and in several others, and I expect it to increase. So I'm a big proponent of shift left. We want to do things earlier in the cycle. In this particular area of software supply chain, that means you want to do things like the Army did, get all the way back into, hey, it actually even matters to your procurement officers whether you know what it is you're buying. Okay, but a friend of mine, Dimitri Raidman of Cybeats, brought up an interesting concept that I've now adopted. We also need to shift right. In other words, it's not just enough that we put the product out the door. Okay, we need to continue to watch it because it might be tomorrow the vulnerability that actually affects my product comes out, and I need to be able to respond to that. And waiting till tomorrow to respond to it means I won't respond as quickly as if I responded now. So for example, let me do a little bit more of this one. I got a couple other examples on that. So Cybeats, the same company that Dimitri works for, he actually founded. Again, just data from them from the conference a couple weeks ago. One of their industrial control system customers saw a 76% efficiency improvement and saved about 500 hours per open source project that they were doing. Another one of their customers reduced their vulnerability review time frame. So basically every day new vulnerabilities come out, you got to review them. And they were taking about a day to review them. In other words, they were never catching up. And they reduced it down to under an hour. So now they're operating in essentially real time. Both of those result in both time savings, but also people savings. And both of those translate into money savings. Another one of these vendors in this space, I don't know if they call it SUS or they call it SOOS. I should ask them. I've been talking with them, but I forgot to ask him what he actually calls his company. Anyway, they had one of their customers show a 10% of developer efficiency, and actual more detailed numbers by automating the software supply chain stuff. Several other customers reported a 30% increase, so somewhere in the 10 to 30% range, you could say. And it's interesting that some of their customers actually reported a reduction in their tooling costs as they began to understand what it is they were actually doing and where they were getting their components from and what they were doing. I know, again, anecdotal from my own personal experiences, in general, when doing this, diving into the software inventory, you almost always find something you weren't expecting that usually results in some sort of improvement. Which means, you respond to everything faster. So again, one particular one from Log4j was really much quicker. Again, this one person couldn't say where they worked, but a particular software developer worked in 2 different organizations. He was literally switching between 2 orgs when Log4j hit. One of them had previously implemented this stuff, one of them hadn't. One of them had all their answers in 7 minutes. The other one had to pull 5 people out of development, spend a full week figuring it out. A full week is actually good in many cases. There's some documented cases in the utility industry where it took 2 years to actually figure out whether they were affected by it. Oracle, again, major, large software provider. Bruce, I happen to know Bruce at Oracle, who stands up at many of our conferences and presents the data on, because they were prepared ahead of time. They have thousands of products with thousands of customers, and within 2 hours, they knew what they needed to do and did it. So again, cost value there. Similarly, Cassie Crossley of Snyder Electric has actually written a book on this. I should have brought her book and handed it out as well. I apologize for that. It's only literally hot off the press. She wrote a book on software supply chain. She is actually the P-Cert manager at Snyder Electric, a really major OEM provider to many different industries. And they have an objective of reducing their P-Cert team staff hours for vulnerability management by 80%. They're not there yet. They're only partway through their program at the moment, but they're well on their way to meeting that goal. Again, these are numbers that you can plug into all of these things. One of the ones that frequently gets left out is the secondary risk. Another standard I'd highly recommend people look at is a legal standard written by lawyers on cybersecurity called DOCRA. It's called Duty of Care Risk Analysis, and it's sort of hey, if you don't do this kind of stuff, when something bad occurs, you're likely to get sued and lose. If you do this kind of stuff, when you get sued, you're likely to win. So it's, again, it's a type of thing people don't always look at and probably should. Very involved in the Open Cybersecurity Alliance, which is a group working on open source projects and open source standard interfaces to make vendor agnostic cybersecurity automation. It's got a cybersecurity automation sub-project, which runs something called the Cybersecurity Automation Village, which makes use of this alphabet soup to basically do tabletop exercises and actual real life, get gear talking to each other. We've had a number of them. They started before this, but they started before 2020, but here's the list of the last 6 of them and sort of what they were focusing on. The next one's coming up in Washington in January. It's going to be hosted by AT&T, and it's going to sort of concentrate on Volt Typhoon as its sort of scenario to work towards. We do things like Comply to Connect, which we call a practitioner use case. You get down to the details. This is actually the visual representation of a Cacao playbook. It's actually way oversimplified. When you get into the real details, it's more complicated, but we were talking, the question got asked before about VEXs. The VEX can say things like it's not affected, it's affected, or it's on investigation. and you say, yeah, the vendor's telling me it's not affected. Why are they saying it's not affected? They can give you further information like, no, that component's not even present. My Raspberry Pi is running on Elixir. It's not running on Java. I don't need to worry about Log4j. Or they might say, no, we have that bad code. It just, we can't get at it. You know, our code's written such that it doesn't get called. Well, if you know anything about hacking, you know that you can do a chained attack to maybe get at that. So maybe I don't trust that one quite as much as the component not present. And maybe that one, well, maybe I still put their product in because I need to or whatever, but I turn on some other security controls around it. Maybe going so far as leaving some threat hunting going around and going, hey, I know that they might be able to get at that thing. I better watch it closer, that sort of thing. So we get into that level of detail. We also come up with these made-up kind of scenarios. We invented a ransomware called the Witchy-Washy ransomware and did a 6-day sort of 6 organizations responding at different times to the ransomware in different ways. I started out with, whoops. Why do I keep going backwards? And I go backwards line. My fingers must hit the screen funny. 10 minutes, okay. I'll go quick through some of this. So take a bunch of these standards, make use of them to deal with this fictitious law firm that, because it's Murphy's Law, gets hit at the worst possible time with a 0 day. And how do you react to the 0 day? And because they implemented all of our standards, they react very well and they share the information such that when you get to, well, before we do that. So in that particular scenario, we had a bunch of actual organizations who have actual software talking to each other, you know, with these standards. And we use this funny little gear thing to say that it was, you know, actual doing it. We also we put humans in the loop when we have to and put a little human on it, or we have a little hand wavy in there because sometimes we have to do hand wavy stuff. Hand wavy stuff is usually because vendors can do some of the information that we need. They just can't do it with the standard interfaces. I mentioned Kestrel, this sort of threat hunting. One of the scenarios kicked off is, hey, I need to kick off some threat hunting. We get into the gory details of actually, this is a sort of generic diagram, but we get into actually using the threat hunting language to do something in the actual gear that we're talking about. Day 2 is, hey, it's still a 0 day. We haven't solved it, but because we learned a lot from day 1 and because Murphy's was a member of their ISAC, and the ISAC shared the information, and On Deck Holdings got that information. When they got attacked, they could respond very quickly. It moves, and then we used all these standards to do that. Day 3, it moves into a scenario where, hey, it's now an end day. It's not a 0 day anymore. We can actually keep it from going in beforehand because we know what the software vulnerabilities are exploiting are. We can actually go use our SBOMs, clean them up, fix the vulnerabilities before they're affected. And because we have VEXs, only do the ones we really need to do, et cetera. We get the government involved with no such agency, which is a made-up agency in the U.S. Department of Factoids, because again, we don't want to use any real names. They happen to have this comply to connect thing that I talked about earlier that they have to do. So they're already in a clean state, but some new device comes in. Hey, you want to check that it doesn't have this particular vulnerability in it. Get law enforcement involved because, hey, they've been involved since the beginning. They start sharing standards. They go in and arrest a bunch of bad people. They shared some of the data with STIX, but they also introduced another standard called NEAM. That's a government standard on basically how to share information, particularly between law enforcement and the judicial branch, but it's used in a lot of other things as well, agriculture and stuff like that. And then we get down to military ops, which we can either confirm or deny that maybe this came from a foreign nation state. And the U.S. government shared with its NATO allies and went in and, you know, bombed the heck out of the actual servers or whatever. So I'm going to skip through a lot of details on there. And actually, I had some duplicated slides I didn't mean to have in there. Most recent one we did was on Olympic Destroyer. So Wishy-Washy was a totally made up that we made to show off stuff. Olympic Destroyer, one of the members of our team, is actually on the sports ISAC and actually deals with the real Olympics and the attacks that go on there. And for those of you who don't remember, the Olympic Destroyer was the attack that occurred during the opening ceremony of the Seoul Olympics. And we used the real data from that, walked through a bunch of scenarios with that, used a bunch of these standards, showed how it's saved. We talked about... So when we bring these things, we bring real software. We need some things to protect. So I like to program little Raspberry Pis like this one here that has, you know, like blinky lights on it. The Raspberry Pi is the tiny thing behind the LEDs and totally dwarfed by the battery. And that one's not really, networked in at the moment, but you could pretend that if it was, you could send it OpenC2 commands that would change, the blinky from being blinky to being all red or whatever. And that's useful in these kind of exercises because, you're sending commands and, nothing happens. So it's nice when something happens, even though nobody really cares about the lights being different colors. And there's also what's called the twinkly version of it. There's a digital twin that exists on a web server. Again, this one's way more complicated, has a much more complicated SBOM, more likely to have vulnerabilities in it, that we handle that. So what should you be taking away from my talk? First, that standards enable automation. The automation saves you time, people, and money. Think evilly, act ethically. Worth repeating, because I think this is sort of a touchstone of cybersecurity. In the end, the trust we place in our digital infrastructure should be proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is and to the consequences we will incur if that trust is misplaced. You need to turn that into money. You do that by reading this book. I'd like to get you all involved, if you could, in the Cybersecurity Automation Project and the Cybersecurity Automation Village. Raise your hand if you thought any of this was useful. Put up some fingers. If you thought it was useless, show a fist. All right, good. All right. Well, with that, thank you for your time. There's never enough of it. Thank you for yours. And so we still have a few minutes for Q&A.
Right,
we actually have mics for this one. So
yeah. Sorry about earlier.
Okay, so I've been doing security for 20 plus years.
Okay, you're a youngster, but okay.
But I'll admit to this, that circle of all these standards is even overwhelming for me to consider. How does somebody, even who's been doing security a long time, try to start to learn enough about these to be able to integrate them effectively?
Well, that is an excellent question. First, I'd say start small. You got to start relative to what you need most. Okay, so sort of what will move the needle the most on your financial needs, and look at, hey, what problem do I need to solve, and then maybe look at the actual, Google Open Cybersecurity Alliance, and maybe look at that wishy-washy ransomware, has more detail in it than I just said, and look at it and say, hey, does any of this apply to me? Does any of this help? And then just ask any of us involved in that organization, because we're all zealots in this particular area. Happy to talk your ear. You can call me. I'm happy to talk your ear off on all of them. But it is a problem, and it is a real problem. We're in a very complicated field, and we don't share enough among ourselves in general in all this stuff. So yeah.
Anybody else? I
Other
got a
questions?
question for you, Duncan. I got a question for you.
Sure.
There's a lot of stuff. I'm with Chris here. I've been around for a little bit, but still learned a lot today. Have you come across any organizations that have actually implemented all of that? Because
No.
that seems like a very high level of maturity.
No, I would say Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab is probably the best I know of at it. And by the way, since they're protecting our nuclear weapons, I'm very happy that they're the best people at it that I know of. But even there, they actually run a couple of the groups that we're talking about there, and even they're still advancing the field. So yeah, and even if I could answer yes today to any, it'd probably be a different answer tomorrow, because it's a moving target. I'd like to say back when I was at AT&T that they were nearer to it, but that was A, a long time ago, so half the stuff didn't exist, and B, it wasn't true either. We tried to. There's a lot of organizations that are very good at security. The ones that I've found, and by the way, you don't have to implement everything. You have to implement what you need to get your security to the state you want it to be in, because you can't afford everything. One of the things I point out when I am advising boards on this stuff is this, particularly the turning it into finance in this book, which, by the way, I meant to give you because you asked the first question. So that's another thing. You can read the book. Is that This is useful to also decide what you don't need to do. You don't need that 5th IDS after you already have 4 or whatever, because if you can't make that chart that moves the needle that shows, hey, at least the average moved over or the low probability event became even lower probability event, then you probably shouldn't be spending the money. And we don't use that enough. So,
Anybody else? There we go. Hang on.
they might be recording it too, though. It might be easier for that.
So I came late to the event, but I was curious, we all deal with commercial off-the-shelf software. How does the SBOM approach impact what we use as a consumer on a daily basis?
Well, the analogy we usually use is very similar to the food. It used to be that, actually, even when I was a kid, not everything came labeled with all the ingredients, okay? I view SBOMs as eventually getting to the point where we all know what's all in our software, not because we need all that information all the time, because we need it when we need it for what we need it for. So if I have a peanut allergy, I'd like to know if there's peanuts in the food I'm eating. Well, if Log4Shell just came out, I'd like to know if Log4j of the correct version is in the software I have. So, so actually, re-ask your question so I can reframe it in terms of that.
So, commercial off-the-shelf software, COTS.
Right.
And I used to approach this from a military perspective, is that we should actually be seeing SBOMs for everything. But
Agree.
that's not true.
Well, it's not true yet. It's true for the Army now, but it'll eventually be true for more. But you should be looking at, well, here's a different way to word it. So some of the other guidance we've come out with is, if you're not provided, if you're buying a commercial piece of software and you're not provided the SBOM, then you are transferring risk from the supplier to yourself, and you should be given something for that. So for example, Bank of America in their procurement guidelines has negotiating instruction. They've done this for like 10 years now. Finance was the first on board with SBOMs. They've had this for a while. They actually have it in their negotiating instructions on how to negotiate better terms and conditions because of that risk transfer. That you can say to your customer, hey, say to your vendor, hey, you're transferring risk to me, I got to get something for it. If you're not going to let me know that you're hiding something from me, you got to let me know. So the world's a very different place than it was a few years ago. I highly recommend reading the DACRA and calibrate it with, hey, when you end up in court, it's going to be 3-5 years from now. It's not going to be tomorrow. So you have to predict in the future what a jury is going to be considered reasonable. So when antivirus first came out, it wasn't considered reasonable to have it. A few years later, if you didn't have antivirus, no, you were unreasonable. We have to now predict, hey, is this stuff going to be something that's considered reasonable? I think the average person's going to consider it yes, particularly since the federal government's going to start requiring it of its supply chain. And by the way, when the federal government requires it of its supply chain, and since it turtles all the way down, it means not only of its suppliers, but the suppliers to its suppliers, and the suppliers to the suppliers to its suppliers, which means it's going to take a while because they're only going to start with critical infrastructure. They're going to start in the military. It's going to take a while to morph out. But by a few years from now, it's going to morph out to everything. So the real answer to your question is it's your call on the risk you're willing to accept.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any more questions? All right, let's thank Duncan with a round of applause.
Thank you.